Hello everyone, welcome to the video and welcome to Get a Grip. If you're new, welcome, and if you like what you hear on this video or if you don't like what you hear on this video, please make a comment, because that's the whole idea of the channel, is for us to talk about these things. Free speech is fundamental, and I think free speech is being shut down, and identity politics is a major weapon that the left use in order to try and shut down that free speech by a certain group that obviously they identify. Great if you could give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and do everything you can to share this video, because I think everyone needs to be aware of it, and I think everyone needs to talk about it and really talk about what's making this such a huge issue and what are the politics behind all of this. So I'm going to talk about today, or the video is going to be based on socialism, identity politics, and really how the left, the Marxists, use this tactic to try and divide and conquer. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in any of this, but luckily I've heard of a man who is. That man is called Jordan Peterson. I'm quite a fan of his. I've watched quite a lot of his videos, and I think the man talks complete sense and has got very valid arguments. You might have heard of Jordan Peterson in connection with an interview that was done by Channel 4. It's quite famous now. It's called the So What You're Saying interview, and I think what that interview really did, it highlighted how the left immediately tried to attack Jordan Peterson, to label him, put a label on him, which is what the left do, to mark him down as far right, simply because maybe someone from the right had read one of his books or something like that. Call him sexist, call him anti-LGBTQ+, and throw every kind of identity at him to try and shut him down. Luckily for us, this guy is incredibly intelligent and, ran rings around these people. So for a lot of this video, I'm going to be jumping in and out of a presentation that he did about 2 years ago. And, the premise of the presentation from him is to do with identity politics, Marxism, and white privilege. So here we go.
And they make it racial, and they make it sexual, and they make it ethnic and all of that. That's actually technically incorrect, by the way, because I study individual differences. So those are the differences between people. And I know the literature. So you know about James Damore's memo, right, from Google. He wrote that partly because he was watching my videos, which is why he wanted me to interview him. And I'm a believer that there are biological differences in temperament between men and women, apart from the other obvious differences, and that they're actually not trivial. And that they maximize in the societies that have moved farthest to producing egalitarian states, the Scandinavian countries, and that the reason for that is that there's two reasons why men and women differ in temperament. One is biological and the other is environmental. And if you remove the environmental variation, which you do if you make the state egalitarian, you maximize the genetic variation. And that's been demonstrated in the scientific literature over about 4 decades. And no one wanted it or hoped for it, and they weren't biased in looking for it, because that was exactly the opposite of what social scientists wanted to find. Because social scientists lean heavily to the left, and what they wanted to find was you flatten out the state so that everyone has equal opportunity and the differences between people disappear. That is not what happened. The opposite happened. That was wrong, and no one was happy about it, and no one's happy about it now. You can actually tell when you've discovered something in a social science, because you're not happy about it.
So there, Jordan Peterson's basically saying, there are differences between people. This is one of the big things that the left attack him for, because he says there are differences between men, there are differences between women. Those differences are not just down to gender, they're down to a lot of other factors. This guy is a clinical psychologist, and he's also a lecturer at the university in Toronto. He also cites there is in countries where, the left has really taken control, such as Scandinavia, where all of the alleged hierarchical reasons, the patriarchy reasons for women not to do so well have been removed, and they've been removed for several years, that the differences have actually become bigger between the sexes. They do not choose the same careers, and what the left wanted and the identity politics wanted Didn't happen. In fact, it was the absolute opposite. And he ends that bit there with basically saying, well, they're not happy about it. So, you can tell they've discovered something that actually means something. So let's move on.
And the difference is approximately this. If you take random pairs of men and women out of the population, let's say you had to make a bet on who was more agreeable. If you bet that it was the woman, you'd be right 60% of the time. Well, that's not that much. It means you'd be wrong 40% of the time. That's almost 50% of the time. So this is a big difference by social science standards, but that's the magnitude of the difference. There are some differences that are bigger, like the difference between men and women's interest in people versus things is actually bigger than that. That's the biggest difference we know. But it's a big difference, let's say, the agreeableness difference, but still, the shared attributes of men and women far outweigh the attributes that differentiate them. Because you could ask, are there more differences within groups or between them? Now, the postmodern answer to that is between them. That's why you need diversity by group, right? That's why you need different races. That's why you need different ethnicities and sexual preferences and all of that. Well, that's wrong. There's more difference within the groups than there is between them. You don't get diversity by crossing the groups. You get diversity by selecting across individuals. In fact, the idea that there is more differences between groups than there is between individuals is actually the fundamental racist idea. It's the fundamental racist idea, which is, well, let's say you're Asian, Oriental, to use the old word to discriminate the one type of Asian, say, from the other. You're so different from me that there's no overlap between our groups. And you're also so different, and there's so little difference within your group that now that I know that you're not me, you're not one of mine, I actually know what you're like.
Okay, so there's a lot to take on there. The first thing that I take from that is this leftist, Marxist identity politics approach where everyone must be put into a group. Also, the idea that the left push is that what he says there's more differences between the groups. No, that's wrong. There's more differences between individuals within the groups. He also makes a great point there. What I feel is, true diversity is a mix of individuals, not a mix of groups. I think the biggest point here that the left just completely ignores is when he says there are more similarities between the groups than there are differences. So what he's saying there is, if we look at the similarities, we're all pretty much the same. But the left want to push the differences. They want to put you into a group and they want to speak for you. One of the biggest things in that really is the fact that he says, if you insist on putting people into groups and you insist on putting attributes onto those people, that's fundamentally racist. Putting people into groups is a massive tactic of the left, of the socialists, and they use it all the time. They use it to say that they're speaking out for these groups, but they also use it to shut other groups down, to say, we've identified you as this group, therefore you have no right to speak. This is what I think is fundamentally wrong in today's politics and absolutely wrong in today's mainstream media. So let's carry on through the presentation and see the other fundamental arguments that Jordan Peterson raises against Marxism and against identity politics.
Diversity is actually necessary because people differ in intelligence and they differ in temperament and they differ in skills, and so you actually need diversity because otherwise you can't take advantage of all those differences. So you need diversity, but you need genuine diversity. And what would genuine diversity mean? If you're trying to put together a work team, you want people of sufficient diversity so that you gather together the appropriate talents to produce the implement that's necessary to work properly in the world. That's a competence marker, because otherwise your business is going to fail.
So again, he raises a really valid point there and points out what is genuine diversity. Excellent example. Okay, if you want to get a job done, you want to make a company, you need a diversity of competence. And as we've seen, what the left will do is say, no, you need diversity of race, you need diversity of sexuality, etc., etc. And, you must tick those boxes in order to fill those jobs. Otherwise, you're racist or you're sexist, etc.
It's all oh my God, I'm oppressed. Of course you're oppressed, but you're not oppressed by the patriarchy, for God's sake.
Yeah, there you go. Standard argument from the left. I'm oppressed, I'm discriminated against, and I'm going to blame any other group that I've labelled as not mine for that oppression and for that discrimination.
In fact, we would say that when a person in a hierarchy starts to act like their position entitles them to power, then that hierarchy has become corrupt. Harvey Weinstein's a good example of that. I'm serious. It's like he acted like a tyrant. What happened to him? It's not good. Not good for him. What he did was not good. But it's an indication, it's revealed, it's an indication that the misuse, so he's competent. Fine, he gets to have position because we need people who are competent. But that doesn't mean you get to turn into a tyrant. If you turn into a tyrant, then that overshadows your competence, and out you go. That's the definition of a functioning state. And our state essentially functions. It's not perfect, that's for sure. But compared to what? That's the issue. Compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia. Well, compared to your hypothetical Marxist utopia, I mean, we're living in Auschwitz. But your actual Marxist utopia is indistinguishable from Auschwitz. So we're not listening to that comparison. We're going to take a look at what we have, and we're going to compare it to other places that actually existed in time and geographically. And by those criteria, it's like, is there another time you'd rather live? Is there another place you'd rather live? I mean, a real place in a real time. I mean, you want to live back in 1895, even in the Western world, where the average person lived on less than $1 a day in today's money? You want to live like those coal miners? It's like the answer to that's no. If you have any sense, you should have some gratitude. That's another problem with the postmodern neo-Marxists, like zero gratitude.
I think there he raises some brilliant comparisons and says, okay, the left, you're offering people this, imaginary utopia where everything's perfect and everyone's equal. What Jordan Peterson basically says is, okay, well, let's compare that to the real world where that's been tried out. Let's compare that to another time. Let's compare that to another country, usually, let's say, a Russian country, a communist country, and let's look at the differences. Where would you rather be?
So you have status in a hierarchy. You might say, well, that's like a reward. So you're a high status person. It's a reward. The reward should be shared equally. It's like a badge of merit that you get. It's a privilege. It's not. The reason that in a capitalist society, filthy, selfish capitalists put you in the position so they can extract maximum productivity from you. And that's exactly why you're there. You get paid so you keep working. Why do we want you to work? Because your work is actually valuable to us. And so we're going to pay you so you don't quit. It's not a reward because you're a good guy. It's not a privilege. That's not what it is. You don't hand those things out like merit badges. That's not how it works. The society is set up on selfish principles. We pay people who are competent so they won't stop striving because we want what they can produce. So you don't just distribute that like it's a gift. It's not a gift. It's not a gift at all. So that's another place where they're wrong. Social status and payment is the consequence of the selfish desire of individuals and the group to extract resources of intellect, creativity, and industriousness from those who possess them in excess. Now, of course, it's not 100% like that. There's incompetent people who rise to the top. You can fool people and you can manipulate them and you can act like a tyrant. And, we might say maybe the system is like 30% warped, something like that. It's not much more than that because we can account for people's success across life by looking at their individual differences, intelligence, conscientiousness, emotional stability, creativity. We can do a pretty good job of predicting their trajectory. So there's error. Some of it's health, right? Because sometimes you've got what you need, but you get cut off at the knees, or your family members do, or, some tragic thing befalls you. There's a randomness in the system that accounts for a fair bit of it. And then there's a certain amount of corruption. Fair enough. But not so much that the lights go off. So
again, what he's saying there is you can't just attribute people's success down to these four simple categories, of race, gender, sexuality, etc. And now he's going to move on and talk about that hot topic, which is white privilege.
I want to talk about intersectionality and white privilege a bit. So I first said, well, we analyzed Marxism, we analyzed postmodernism. I suggested that postmodernism was a way for the Marxists to keep going under a new guise. I suggested that Marxism was fundamentally based on hatred rather than sympathy and empathy. I suggested that the corpses were the evidence for that. I told you why I think postmodernism is fundamentally wrong. But now I want to talk to you a little bit about white privilege. So the first thing that and I haven't got this quite figured out yet, I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity, let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary, right? In fact, given that there's an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world, you could immediately point out that there's an infinite number of dimensions along which people vary. And so then the postmodern question is, why would you privilege some of those dimensions over the other? And I would say, well, because it sustains your bloody Marxist interpretation, that's why. But you're not going to say that because it marginalizes, right? You've marginalized that so you can ignore it.
So now we get to the part of his presentation where the far left, the socialists, the Marxists, their ears are really going to prick up, because now he's talking about white privilege. And white privilege is a term that I am really offended by, and I take offense to it. So he also then goes on to talk about intersectionality and, you know, the complications and the really arbitrary 4 or 5 definitions that the left give, you know, race, ethnicity, religion, etc., sexuality, all that stuff, which is what's thrown at us every day. He makes a really good point, which I agree with here. There are many, many, many reasons why individuals are different. Why does the left continue to put people into groups, say that they speak for those groups, and then also shut down others? So let's see. The Marxists are going to be chomping at the bit at this point.
Here's some ways people differ. Intelligence, temperament, geography, historical time. You live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, that's a big one. That's a big one. Would you imagine you could, we won't go there either. Youth, it's advantageous to be young. You've got potential. It's advantageous to be old. You've got wealth. Health, that's a good one. Sex, women have advantages. Men have advantages. Maybe one has more than the other. It's not self-evident. Women live about 8 years longer. They're multi-orgasmic. Athleticism, wealth, family structure, friendship, education. Well, then there's the classic, you know, postmodern ones, race, ethnicity, etc. Why not those other dimensions of variation? There's no evidence that they're less important. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that they're more important. So, like, why not consider them? Then you get intersectionality. This is one of the things that's really comical, I think, because the postmodernists, identity politics types, actually realized this. They thought, well, okay, race and gender. Fair enough. But what if you're a black woman? Well, that's a problem because, well, now you've got 2 dimensions of differentiation. What the hell are we going to do about that? And what if you're gay and black and female? Well, then what if you're not very bright and gay and black and female? And then what if you're ugly and not very bright and gay and black and female? And like, you can keep playing that game. You can keep playing that game an infinite number of ways, because there's an infinite number of ways to categorize things, as the postmodernists already pointed out. And so the intersectionality theorists came along to plug the hole, but they don't know where they're going. They don't understand that the logical conclusion of intersectionality is individuality. Because there's so many different ways of categorizing people's advantages and disadvantages that if you take that all the way out to the end, you say, well, the individual is the ultimate minority. And that's exactly right, and that's exactly what the West discovered. And, you know, the intersectionalists will get there if they don't kill everyone first.
So bear in mind, this presentation was given about 2 years ago, And I think now you can see the basis that a lot of what we live with today, this hierarchy of oppression, is based on what he's talking about that come out back then. What we can see now is this continual identity politics that is now creating so many groups and so many genders that ultimately, as he says, we'll end up with the ultimate minority, which is the individual. And that's who I stand for. I stand for the individual. I don't stand for the group. I am a person. I have my own views and I have my own opinions on all different things. I do not go along with group logic like the left would like to impose on me, and like the left would like to say that they speak for those groups.
So, on to white privilege. So it's really interesting to find out where these ideas come from, because usually the scholarship is so awful, you just cannot possibly believe it. It's just absolutely, it wouldn't, at the University of Toronto in the psychology department, the original paper on white privilege wouldn't have received a passing grade for the hypothesis part of a undergraduate honors thesis. We're not even close. There's no methodology at all. The person who wrote it, it was called White Privilege and Male Privilege. A personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. Well, first of all, personal account, it's like, sorry, no. So she listed a bunch of ways that she thought, she says, these are personal examples of her unearned privilege, or unearned privilege that she saw as she experienced in the 1970s and 1980s. So this, by the way, this idea is the opinion of one person who wrote one paper that has absolutely no empirical backing whatsoever, which is a set of hypotheses which had never been subject to any statistical analysis. Like, if I ask you a bunch of questions, it's not obvious how many questions I'm asking you, because I could say, how tall are you? Or I could say, if you're laying on the ground, how extended would you be? It's like, that 2 questions? It's like, no, it's 1 question. It's just asked 2 ways. And the way you figure out if you ask someone a bunch of questions, how many questions you're asking them, is by doing something called a factor analysis, which is kind of an elementary form now of social science investigation. If you make a questionnaire, you have to subject it to a factor analysis, because you've got to find out how many questions you're asking. Because you might think it's 60, but it's probably not. It's probably 5. That's the big 5, by the way. Anyways, who cares about that? There's no such thing as methodology anyways. That's all part of the oppressive white male European patriarchy. So we can just not bother with that, and we can pen a few notes about how we think the world is constructed, and then we can screw up the entire political system 2 decades later. Okay, so here's her white privilege.
So Jordan Peterson is an intellectual. He's a university professor. He's written books, and he's well studied and well educated. Highlighting here is the source of the basis for white privilege, which is a person, and also the quality of the research. And he says basically they're so low down that it wouldn't have even got a pass grade at a very low university level. Another thing I just want to put out here is that this theory of white privilege is based on one person's observations made between the 1970s and the 1980s. The left of today, and especially the youth of today, as we've seen demonstrated in the last few days, have jumped on this term, and to them it is a term because they don't actually know what it means and what it stands for, and they scream and shout it at people, and you know, it's got no base, it has no core. And now let's see how Jordan moves on.
Okay, so here's her white privilege list, some of it. There's like 50 things. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. That's actually a wealth thing, by the way. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on my television or open to the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. When I'm told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. Well, there's 50 of those, I think, something like that. Okay. Is that white privilege, or is that like majority privilege? Is the same true? You go to China, you're Chinese. Is the same true if you're Chinese? Is it majority privilege? And if it's majority privilege, isn't that just part of living within your culture? So let's say you live in your culture, you're privileged as a member of that culture. Well, obviously, that's what the culture is for. That's what it's for. Why would you bother building the damn thing if it didn't accrue benefits to you? Now, you might say, well, one of the consequences is that it accrues fewer benefits to those who aren't in the culture. Yeah, but you can't immediately associate that with race. You can't just do that, say it's white privilege. There's many things it could be. It certainly could be wealth, and the intersectional people have already figured out that there's many things it could be. So, what the hell? Seriously, well, what's going on? Well, we let these pseudo-disciplines into the university because we're stupid and guilty, seriously. And they have no methodological requirements and plenty of power and plenty of time to produce nonsensical research and produce resentful activists, and now we're bearing the fruits of that. It's not pretty. So white privilege. Well, the other thing you might notice is that to attribute to the individuals of a community the attributes of that community on the basis of their racial identity is called racism. That's what racism is. There's no other way of defining it. It's attributing to the individual the characteristics of the group as if the group was homogeneous. Now, the intersectional people have already decided that's not a fair game because there's so many differences between people. But the postmodernists don't care about logical coherence because they regard logical coherence, here it comes again, as a creation of the white European male patriarchal structure that's designed to oppress the oppressed. And that's technically the case. So logical incoherence, it doesn't matter. And you could say, well, if you act out your logically incoherent ideas in the world, you're going to run face first into a brick wall. And the postmodern answer to that is, there's actually no real world. It's all interpretation. So there's no having that discussion, but the postmodernists don't care because they don't believe that discussion between people of different power groups is possible anyways. So here we are.
So I think Jordan Peterson sums that up really well, basically. One of the key things that he says is that identity politics is racist. You're attributing people's perceptions, people's beliefs according to their race, and that's called racism. Bear in mind, this was 2 years ago, and he talks about resentful activists. Now, I think we've just seen that demonstrated in the US and in the UK. I would consider resentful activists Antifa. They are the far left. They are the socialists. You'll see them carrying the Russian flag, etc. And I think, Jordan, maybe some more people should have listened to this guy. It's another excellent point. We allow these people into these universities because we're stupid and because we feel guilty. That seems to be the number one aim, is for white people to feel guilty and to apologize for anything that any white person has ever done in history, and we should all bow down because we're such terrible tyrants and terrible oppressors. I agree with what he says. There are many things that make people different. People are individuals. I am not a group, I am an individual. The left will constantly identify these groups, and I would say that is the ultimate in identity politics. They'll also turn around and say that people, if they're not in agreement with their socialist policies, use popularist politics to get their point across. They'll criticize Trump, they'll criticize Boris. The way I see it is those people are talking to everybody, in which case it's the biggest minority, let's say. But the left won't have that. They'll say, no, that's far right, that's anti-woke, etc. And they try and shut it down. This is the whole problem that I've got with this. It's this unwillingness to engage. It's this unwillingness to accept another person's point of view and really just carry on pushing this group identity and this division. And I think what we've seen on the streets in London and what we've seen on the streets in America sums up what these Marxists and identity politics are all about, is division and conflict. That's just my opinion. And, I want you guys to have your say. What do you think? Place a comment. Let's talk about this, because a lot of the time, whether you're black, white, whatever, I don't care what religion or race you are, let's talk about it, because we're constantly being told that we can't. We're being told that a person from one of these groups or a person that speaks from one of these groups just tells us what our opinion is. And that I don't agree with. We are individuals. I'd also like to just apologise for some of the terrible sound quality here. I'm just one guy, and I'm working on a laptop. I don't have any studio equipment, and of course, next door the builders are in doing some decorating. There's a funny story with that. Whereas I don't have a lot of money, so I thought I'd buy a microphone because I know the sound's been a bit dodgy in some of the other videos. Microphone arrived yesterday, but me being me, the microphone didn't come with a stand and it didn't come with a power supply. So where I thought I was getting a really good deal and a nice cheap microphone, the stand and the power supply have actually cost me more than the microphone. So yeah, that's sort of my white privilege in that way. I've just had 3 scrambled eggs and a can of baked beans for my breakfast. So again, that must be my white privilege. But you know, let's talk about this because I think it's getting out of control. And I'm going to leave you with that. So let us know what you think. Until the next one.